conversation. Thanks for so many people coming. This is awesome. I'm glad that there's a lot of interest in this topic. Today's conversation is sponsored by the Allied Students for Another Politics, or ASAP for short, and the Anarres. That's the first applause we've ever got. And the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures, if you want to applaud that too. So the Anarres Project is located here at OSU campus. It's inspired by the visionary fiction of writers such as Ursula K. Le Guin and Octavia Butler. The Anarres Project is interested in having conversations about possible futures, ones that are informed by justice, solidarity, cooperation, and mutual aid. So there's an online website for the Anarres Project. It's anarresproject.org. It has activists and organizers from all over the country and all over the world that are having these very conversations about what that future might look like and how we can get there. So check that out. Allied Students for Another Politics is a new organization at OSU. It's a radical left student-led activist organization. We run on horizontal lines of organizing, meaning that we have no official leaders because we believe that we are all leaders. So if you're interested, there's some material on ASAP in the back, and thanks again for coming. Today, this series that you're attending is called The Radical Visions Towards Another Politics. And the objective of this series is to get people thinking in terms of transformation instead of reform. We believe that the system cannot be fixed because the system is operating exactly as it was intended to operate. So therefore, we have to look at ways to transform these structures that are oppressive surrounding us. Today, one of those very systems that is needing a transformation is what we call the prison industrial complex. Criticalresistance.org informs us that when we say prison industrial complex, we're referring to the overlapping interest of government and private industry that uses surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. There's over 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States, which far exceeds any country on the planet. Actually, there's more prisoners in the United States today than there was in Gulag-era Soviet Union. So just put it in some perspective and context there. We're really fortunate to have this awesome panel to explore the connections between capitalism, racism, and the prison industrial complex. So if you please, our panel is comprised of Dr. Robert Thompson. He's a professor and chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies. We have Zandro Lerma, MAIS, a master's student in interdisciplinary studies with a focus in ethnic studies, and Amber Moody, a master's student of philosophy. So please welcome, and we'll have a great conversation.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to the Allied Students for Another Politics for hosting and putting on and organizing this event. And I really appreciate your introduction. And it kind of reminded me what, in terms of the reason, part of the radical visions toward another politics, and so kind of help fill in and fill out what I'm going to say today in terms of, I think, one aspect of having a vision towards another politics is
I'm
also,
sorry, but could you speak a little louder? It's hard to hear way back here.
I'll try.
Thank you.
One of the things I think we'll have to do in terms of knowing what this other politics is that we'll have to know something about the myths that govern us, or govern the U.S. in that sense, in the history. And so what I want to do is really begin and sort of short thoughts on this. So this isn't really something that's cohesive in the sense, in that sense, but as things that I've thought about for a while, and then recently, since I've been under the pressure of kind of putting some things together, I thought I'd experiment and go in this direction. So for me, I'm looking at racism, capitalism, and the prison industrial punishment complex as sort of my theme, offsetting the notion that most people have that prisons and jails are for rehabilitation and that, and there'll be a conversation about that later. So I'm going to cover the notion, the idea of myth, mythology, the crisis of capitalism, that part of this is that it makes no sense. People are going to talk about the numbers of people in prison and so on and so forth, but that doesn't change anything. But I think we have to look at what's at the bottom of this, at the heart of this, and I think it's the issue of capitalism. And I like to point to what's called the crises of capitalism, old and new. In that respect, the new being neoliberalism. And also, just some data to kind of get people thinking and looking at least it had me think about it a little bit, is looking at the prison, what we call the prison switch. And I'll probably go into some, not depth, but at least develop that a little more as I get through on page 3 or second page or wherever that is. And then the idea of racism and white supremacy, which has to be discussed and interrogated fully, what I'm not going to do in this, but at least open it up to look at what's happening to people of color in prisons, black people in particular, and poor people of all ethnicities and nationalities in that sense. So anyway, one of the things I want to do is give a definition of myth. And as I use it, myth is a central sense-making process at the heart of any culture, defining its people, its organizations, its norms, and its tensions. The task of mythology, that is, the task of mythology, is to provide society with a stock of stories that hold out the possibility of confronting and suspending the conflicts and contradictions of everyday life. One of the myths that I want to share with you today is that the dominant myth of during the time of slavery was that you could hold that people held in, human beings in slavery, held as chattel or merchandise, were in fact property or merchandise. Another myth today, just kind of tying with that a little bit, is the dominant myth is that corporations are in fact human beings or persons in that sense. But what I want to do also, since many are looking out at the audience here, kind of see that they have some sort of common history or a sense of common history, I'd like to suggest to you that the myth people celebrated on July 4th, the revolution, independence, and rah-rah, and all that stuff, that actually that's a myth. And that actually at the time of that call for independence and no taxation without representation and so on and so forth, was actually a counter-revolution at a time where the major power of the day, England, was in fact vying for abolition and abolishing slavery, at least on the UK, on its homeland, and pushing in other places. And that the landed class arising at that time in what would be the British colonies and become eventually the 13 states, actually decided intentionally to settle on chattel slavery in their form of capitalism on the place called Turtle Island, and creating, if you will, a slave society. That is a society which is defined, that slavery defines every institution, is shaping all aspects of its culture. If you were wondering, slave societies, some societies, people argue, well, all societies have slavery, but they are not slave societies. Yes, most societies have had slaves, but slavery doesn't define every institution, all art, all finance, or anything like that. That's what's different here. So what I want to do here is just briefly look at the crisis, what I call the crisis of capitalism. One of them is in the 17th century, 1600s, about 1660, at the time of the tobacco price fall, where the landed class, the folk with the money were in fact trying to figure out what they're going to do. They were losing profits. And also the other part of that was the problem of the indentures, so sort of, if you will, version white slaves in that sense. And so 1660 is an important year because just 2 years later, you'll have in Virginia, the Virginia legislature deciding that children born to mothers who are in fact slaves will be in fact slaves, no matter who followed, in that sense like that. And just 20 years prior to that, the John Punch incident, John Punch case, that John Punch, a black man, who was an indentured slave who ran away with 2 other slaves, an Irish and a Scots, ran away, and it's that point in 1640 where you get the idea that this black guy is in fact going to be a slave forever, as it says, to his assigns in that sense. So what I want to do is look at, and so the decision to solve the labor crisis was to develop chattel slavery in that sense, and they had to resolve the notion of profits. They had a profit shortfall in that sense. Also, during, just kind of moving on with quick snapshots here, the U.S. Civil War, another crisis, another moment, if you will, the crisis of capital. The North and the South were equally, in different ways, devoted to the issue of slavery in the United States. Lincoln didn't, if you didn't know, Lincoln didn't free one slave. And actually in the war that's usually celebrated and talked about in terms of the freeing of slaves, the whole idea is that it was the war to, and Lincoln says himself, to preserve the Union. You know, I'm not going to go through all his speech, but to preserve the Union. Some can be slaves, I'll do that. If some are all slaves, all are free, so on and so forth. In that sense there. So just kind of give some data looking at it there, that on the Civil War, you had the 13th Amendment that was passed, which in fact did not. Just, and this kind of, I'm hoping, gives some hint at where we are, who we are today, because the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. That was the second 13th Amendment, because once in the early part of the firing, the shooting going on in between the North and the South, the Congress was trying to push through a 13th Amendment, and that was that no state could in fact abolish ever slavery in the United States. That was defeated. Once they started the war, that was tabled, and then we have this new 13th Amendment that says, yeah, you can, slavery's abolished and so on and so forth, except in the case of imprisonment. All right. So, as I said, the 16th Amendment didn't free anyone at all. But in the interregnum of the Reconstruction, the period between the end of the Civil War and then the overthrow of the possible racial democracy that was sort of moving and mobilizing in the South and elsewhere from 1866, 1877, to be exact, Jim Crow replaced the older economic order of Southern chattel slavery with a system of debt peonage, sharecropping, and prison system that desired to hold as many black people as possible in a state of subordination there. Moving on to the early days of the 20th century, if you will, in the 30s, FHA in the crises, another crisis of capitalism, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt is casting about to save capitalism, which he did in a portion of it in the United States. FHA, Federal Housing Authority, and the Social Security did not apply to black folk at all. That would come much later. During the Second World War, the GI Bill did not apply to black veterans who fought in the Second World War. So I say that sort of as prologue or prelogue or to kind of look at today. And this sort of, we're talking about neoliberalism, it's all around us, it's here, it's everywhere. In that sense, the new economic order, or capitalism unfettered, unchained, unregulated, if you will, something like that. But neoliberalism actually thrives on catastrophe. And that is, and I'm looking at it as the three pillars of neoliberalism as we can see them and identify and analyze them today is mass unemployment, mass disfranchisement, and mass incarceration. And not unlike the U.S. in its early beginnings, a slave society. Just to remind you that the U.S. is a carceral, I would argue, a carceral society where persons and security issues dominate most of the public and private social lives of Americans there. So in fact, neoliberalism, as Ajamu Baraka talks about, says neoliberal restructuring of the national economy began in the 1970s. And over the course of 4 decades, economic dislocations was visited upon a large swath of the American workers. But for the African Americans, it was nothing short of catastrophic. So the economic crises, that is, the crises of capitalism, if you will, stripped away the notions of prosperity with no real wage increase, for workers in those 4 decades from 1970 to the present, and in turn made access to easy credit available, i.e. read as debt, for those workers with stagnant wages who would find themselves in what today has become an all too common living from paycheck to paycheck, concomitant with an economic crisis concomitant with the economic crisis, revealed the unacknowledged and unspoken reality for the vast number of unemployed black workers, that they had moved from the category of being a part of, if you will, quote, reserved army of the unemployed, that is, labor ready to be reemployed when the economy picked up, to the category of surplus force, that is, as John Baraka would say, quoting, black laborers had become a workforce and population that was no longer needed in the globalized U.S. economy. So for today, for example, the labor participation of African American men is the lowest on record. The plight of African American women is not as bad, but it is precarious at best. I want to kind of turn this a little bit on, I want to take this even further, actually, because as I said at the beginning, I talked about the myth of the U.S. revolution for independence and the notion of course, establishing chattel slavery, being blacks on Turtle Island, being a land that was already possessed by native indigenous people in that sense. And so I turned to Sidney Wilhelm, who wrote a book, it's an older book, entitled Who Needs the Negro? And the Obsolescence of the Negro. And I think it's time to have sort of a clear understanding of what this means today, because it certainly meant something in the past. As I said earlier, that once the arrangements between the European settlers was over, getting fur or military alliances, and they needed the land, the Native Americans, the Indians, were wiped out. So anyway, Sidney Wilhelm, in his book "Who Needs the Negro," he says that the white America no longer needed the black America's labor, and this does not mean that white America would no longer be racist. On the contrary, he continues, if white America is no longer needed the black American labor, he might then feel free to express his racism fully. And just as an aside, I was reading and hearing a lecture by someone in a book that I read, and I hadn't really looked at this point, where if you're looking at, gave me understanding of the various police shootings and of black folk and other folk of color and pulling children out of chairs and so on and so forth, where Hannah Arendt in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, talks about omnipotent policing, where the police force are let loose on certain targeted communities, not everywhere. And this is where the practice is done, and they become the judge, the jury, and the executioners there. So I would say that's a point there. So in colon there, I said become racist more fully, that not merely to exploit the black American as in the last 300 years, but in fact to kill him. The fact is, since the strong push towards automation, that in the United States' economy, the labor of the black man is increasingly not needed. For instance, and just I kind of gave this to you already, that Native Americans and the Indians were economically useful as long as the Europeans wanted furs rather than land for farming, and militarily useful so long as the North American continent was divided between several European powers vying for the allegiance of various Indian allies. But when the Indians, were no longer useful in either way, they were destroyed. So, the prison, as I call the prison switch, to kind of give you a look, and I'm not going to go into detail, but we can talk about it later in question and answer, I guess. Early on, 40 plus years ago, 1970s, the number of whites in prisons was 70%. and the number of people of color, men, women of color, was 30%. That was 40 years ago, 1970, the data there. Today, that number is switched. You have to ask the question, why? What's gone on? What's happened in that? What's precipitated that kind of switch there? I'd like to end with this point on racism and white supremacy, and drawing on Katie Grimes. She asked the question, what does mass incarceration do? What needs does it fill in the white psyche? She says first, and most importantly, like the ghetto of Jim Crow and slavery before it, mass incarceration keeps the idea of race alive. That is distinctive constellation alive. That is, these institutions produce this division anew and inscribe it in a distinctive constellation of material and symbolic form. In other words, these institutions have worked to continuously racialize African Americans, making them different in some ways, while at the same time hiding the fact that the origins of the difference lies not in biology, not in culture, not in values, but in history. Thank you.